This edition of our weekly webinar series, sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger of China. It is purpose of the committee to raise awareness about the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party, and in particular to expose the lengths to which it has gone for decades now to work assiduously to achieve the destruction of the United States of America through what it calls unrestricted warfare. Each program is devoted in one form or another to exposing such lines of attack and the damage that they've done to date, as well as both the potential for more harm in the future, as well as what we might do to prevent such harm. And indeed, ultimately, we hope, as Ronald Reagan did with the last totalitarian communist ideology that sought the destruction of our country, the Soviet Union, to put the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, where it belongs, on the ash heap of history. There may be an opportunity to advance that purpose. That will be the subject of this webinar. It's about Cuba in the first instance, the possibility that President Trump is poised to bring about the end of the Castro regime that has misruled the country for decades, impoverished its people, and posed a threat to both this country and others throughout the Western Hemisphere as it has advanced the toxic ideology of communism on behalf of not only its own government, but that of the Soviet Union, and subsequently Russia, and now communist China, and yes, indeed, the Iranians as well. We are going to be exploring a very tantalizing possibility, and that is whether, if the Cuban regime finally goes down, whether that will be perhaps not the beginning of the end of the project Xi Jinping has invested massively in, namely the colonization of Latin America, the Western Hemisphere more generally, but perhaps the end of the beginning of that process, which has been moved along by President Trump through what he's done to help bring the Panama Canal back from the clutches of the Chinese Communist Party, and of course to remove its linchpin in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. We'll be talking with a group of superb experts on the Chinese and their agenda, on the kinds of operations that might undo its hold on power in our hemisphere, and most especially on what it will mean if, in fact, this critical linchpin of the Chinese and other enemies' penetration of our Western Hemisphere comes undone in Cuba next. We're praying for that. We're going to hear first from a man who has contributed very faithfully to these programs, as he has to the work more generally of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, of which he is an important member. His name is Captain James Fenel. He's a retired United States Navy intelligence officer. As in the course of his distinguished career in uniform, done surpassingly important work providing early warning of what the CCP and its military, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, have been beavering to do to achieve the capacity that was absent when they started the unrestricted warfare project, namely to engage in full-on kinetic warfare against our country, but have inexorably achieved the capacity to do just that, as well as the not so much non-kinetic, but pre-kinetic kind of warfare. not least, as we often talk about in these programs, with our subsidies, notably in the form of the balance of trade or imbalance of trade, notably the money that has been transferred by Wall Street from American public pension funds and private investors as well. We're going to hear from Captain Fenel about his take on the prospects of the Cuban regime coming undone and having a very important ripple effect in Latin America. We have him via videotape. He gave me an interview as part of our Securing America program on Real America's Voice, heard earlier in this course of this, I think actually past week. We are very privileged to be able to excerpt it and present it to you now. Let's go to the video of Captain Fenel.
The people of Cuba have been under the yoke of communism and the Castro regime for 6 decades. And so what we're seeing there in the reports of people rising up and attacking police stations and government organizations and whatnot, that's an encouraging sign to me that we're making some progress, at least in terms of trying to get these people to recognize that they can be liberated from this yoke. I think it's clear that the Trump administration and President Trump have gone after liberating the Western Hemisphere, this hemispheric defense of basically saying we're not going to allow Russia and China to be able to have free reign and run around in our hemisphere to create havoc, to flood our borders, to bring in weapons, to disrupt the economy, to support narco-terrorism and drug cartels, all of that. So he's gone after it. And Venezuela was obviously a very clear demonstration of his resolve. What he's done with Panama to wrest the Panama Canal from Chinese ownership, that is another major accomplishment that's not getting a lot of attention, in my opinion. And so now the focus on Cuba, it's a clear signal. And I think it's resonating with the people of Latin America, the shield of America. So there's a lot of effort there. And so I think how it plays out, I don't anticipate armed conflict in any way. I think the people of Cuba have a chance here to stand up if we assist them. There's some risks involved, though, in terms of how the regime may react to their people, and if they take a path like we've seen the Iranians do, that could be, very disastrous. And then also, even if we are able to free it up, where do we go from there in terms of who comes in, and what about corruption on the other side, or could that, be recreated? So there's a lot of thinking and planning that needs to come ahead, but I think for the most part, it's an offer of an opportunity to return Cuba to a different age and a different time when it was a vacation spot for most of the Western Hemisphere. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but I'm encouraged to see that President Trump and his team are focused on eradicating and eliminating both Russian and now Chinese influence in our theater, because it's done nothing but really destroy America's national security, especially with that open border that just caused these floods of people to come in. So this is a good thing. We hopefully it can be done peacefully with support to the people there that don't want to be under communism. It's clear that those people don't want that, but it's also clear that they've been under it for 60 years, and they're going to need some assistance to get this done if they can. The Chinese over the last decade or more have, essentially taken over the listening stations that the Russians had, the Soviets had, and the Chinese are not just using it for signals intelligence and communications intelligence intercepts, but I also think that they're using it to help in their future plans to assist their hypersonic glide vehicle program that would be able to, this fractional orbital bombardment system that could strike the U.S. from the southern hemisphere with a shot that we saw them demonstrate in September of 2022, where they launched a hypersonic glide vehicle that circumnavigated the Earth and then landed in the fields in the deserts of China. But they demonstrated the capacity that system can work. So if you fire that south and go through the southern hemisphere, through the Antarctic, and then back up against America's southern border, we don't have the kinds of detection systems that we do along the northern border with NORAD. So I think China's using all of that to be able to basically have a foothold right off our southern border to assist any kind of program in that sense as well. Plus also to just cause, terrorist kinds of activities that we attribute to the Iranian regime, but I don't think we can discount the Chinese Communist Party for what they do and who they fund and what activities that their proxies would be doing in a conflict against us. So it's something that we just don't need to have the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA operating 90, 100 miles off of our shore. It's not safe. If we can get Cuba out from under the reign of the communist regime, that will eliminate the ability, in one sense, for China to be able to spread Marxist and Maoist ideology throughout the Western Hemisphere, which they're doing. And so just on that alone would be a great achievement, just to get that kind of propaganda and communist thinking out of the region and allow people to get back to freedom.
Amen. Captain Fenel, thank you for this important contribution to the program. We're going to hear next from another of our intelligence assets, if you will, man who has not worn the uniform in his intelligence capacity, but was without a uniform. He was working behind enemy lines as a clandestine officer for the Central Intelligence Agency for some 20 years. He served in uniform, however, before that in the United States Army. He has also been an assistant attorney general in Washington State. These days, he is best known perhaps for his extremely formidable and incisive commentaries and analyses published at And Magazine. You can find it at andmagazine.substack.com. His name is Charles Sam Fattis. Among other things, he is the author of both works of fiction and nonfiction, including Beyond Repair, The Decline and Fall of the CIA. We asked Sam to join us again. He was only able to do it via video, again, as part of the programming that we do at Securing America, at Real America's Voice. We've, with his permission, excerpted a clip from his appearance last week, and we will go to it as an important input into our conversation today as well. Let's do that now.
I'm hopeful about the direction that things are going in Cuba. I mean, in terms of our policy toward Cuba and the idea of freedom. And personally, I think that is an example of where we're on exactly the right track. This is economically a very poor nation, sort of tottering along, and starving them of oil and energy is obviously having an immediate impact and a very powerful impact. And I think is a really destabilizing factor. And I think that's a very smart approach, quite honestly. Let's crush these guys. Let's collapse them. The significance of that, I think, is hard for people who, don't spend their lives in national security and intelligence work to understand. But it's not just about freeing the Cuban people. Not that that's inconsequential, because, good Lord, they have lived under tyranny all these decades. But the Cubans are a major force against us in the region. The Cubans are no joke. I mean, their intelligence service is top-notch. They may be the enemy. They are the enemy, but all credit where credit is due. They have eaten our lunch many times, run circles around us, penetrated our intel service, run double agents against us. I can't even begin to identify how many guys we thought were working for us, and the Cubans were playing us for years and feeding us false information. And their special forces, those are the guys who kept Maduro in power. Everybody remembers this operation to go in and grab Maduro. Okay, well, basically everybody that we ended up having to kill in that operation was actually a Cuban soldier. They were all Cubans. That's who kept him in power. So they are a major hostile force in this hemisphere with huge reach. So taking down Cuba doesn't just mean freeing the Cuban people. Again, that's a big deal. But now you have taken away that intelligence service, those special forces guys, those guys that have been all over the hemisphere for decades. I mean, let's remember, we had to track Che Guevara down. I mean, some of my instructors way back when were guys who had been involved in that operation to hunt Che Guevara, because even then, decades ago, they were spreading the revolution everywhere in the hemisphere. And now that they have linked up with the Chinese and amplify that and are part of that effort, it just makes them that much more dangerous. So I think we are on a good path, and I would encourage us to just stay the course and let's bring these guys down. It will transform things. The impact of that won't just be freedom in Cuba, which is big deal. It will be we are all safer in a whole lot of ways. Cuba functions as a huge technical collection platform for both of those entities. It gives them 90 miles off the coast of Florida the capacity to attack our communications, our cyber infrastructure, all of that. I mean, periodically somebody will run an article and say, hey, the Chinese are in Cuba, and it splashes in the news for a while. Okay, well, that's great, but the truth is the Chinese have been in Cuba for a really long time, and not with a handful of guys. They have big listening posts and platforms and technical capabilities. The Russians, the same. I mean, this is back to my point that when you take down that regime and the Cuban people are free, you have also really done significant damage to Russian and Chinese efforts against the United States. You have put them back on their heels.
From your lips to God's ears, Sam Fattis. Thank you for this contribution. Sam is Captain Jim Fenel, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China. Very grateful for both of their service in that role. We're going to talk next to Sergio Deaplan. He is a man who also served in uniform, another 06, an Army colonel, now retired. He served in the first Trump administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere affairs. He has been a businessman, a consultant, and a one-time candidate for governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are very pleased to have him join us as well via the miracle of videotape in an interview that I conducted with him today for this program. And we look forward to seeing that excerpt from Securing America right about now.
I think what you've seen out of Venezuela is something very promising. What you've seen is the Chinese are interested in making money. The Venezuelans stiffed them. The Venezuelans and the Chinese government set up a loan to the tune of $60 billion to explore and exploit the petroleum industry, and the Venezuelans haven't paid them back. And they're waiting for their payments. They're seeing that maybe they lost their money. And if you look at Articles 12 and 13 of the Venezuelan Constitution, you cannot sell oil or any other natural resource into perpetuity, which is exactly what Maduro and Chavez did. So what that means is that now that there's been a change in government, the United States can just use the money that you should be paying back to China because it was done against the Constitution and it's hurting the Venezuelan people, and use that money to help fund some of the things that the Venezuelan people are asking for. That's just one option. But what we've seen is that the Chinese are not particularly interested in hanging around if things don't go well. The Russians were there to sell their goods. Their goods did not get sold. They also were there to sell influence, or at least fulfill Russian needs, which is how can we use this as a platform for intelligence? And they're also packing their bags and leaving. A lot of the Cubans that were supposed to protect Maduro have decided to pack their bags and leave because obviously their performance wasn't at the top of its game when U.S. Special Forces went in there and arrested Maduro. So there's some real benefits in having some of these people either weakened or departing. And the same thing is going to happen in Cuba. the Russians used the Lourdes platform to listen in on the United States, and their presence has been diminished. I'm not there. I don't know the exact number of people that still remain in Cuba, but I would argue that right now they're as uncomfortable as the rest of the Cubans, and they're probably packing their bags and leaving. The same thing with the Chinese. So the impact on their influence in the hemisphere is being reduced. The other thing that is significant is when I was at DASD, we had the best alignment of countries with the United States that we'd had in our history. We're moving back into that direction. The three big players that still remain to be determined is Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. I don't think Mexico is going to go anywhere because they've already established one-party rule, and Mexico is not in a good place as far as governability because they have just one party that governs everything. And Brazil is attempting to duplicate the Mexican model by Lula, who is a convicted felon. And in Colombia, I see more promise. I believe that there's a good chance that these upcoming elections in the next few months are going to yield a U.S.-aligned president that we can work with, especially when we're dealing with the production and cultivation of drugs that are coming out of Colombia, because the cocaine's still coming. If you look at the price in the streets, it's still there. There has been a significant interruption with
Oleg,
the attack on the
could
fast
you
boats,
post
but there's still the
an
drugs still
article
coming
that,
in. So I think with a Colombian government that's more aligned with the United States, we can work that issue a little stronger. There's also the whole issue of
if you could,
what the world is seeing.
I'd like to plug it.
The misery
I'll send it to you
that
as
communist
a signal,
regimes bring to the region.
Copy.
And we're also seeing
and
that
if you
the
can throw it up
Chinese
there,
haven't
I would
quite
take
yet
down,
established
move
the
Brian's
sufficient
off
links
of
to be able to fully have a significant level of influence
we can stick it there.
politically and culturally
Thank you so much,
with the hemisphere. So they're big on being able to continue to do trade because they're mercantilists. But at the end of the day, as we see these countries align with the United States, you see greater levels of cooperation with the United States. The realignment is occurring. Being able to capitalize on that alignment is going to be critical. Going back to Secretary Rubio's plan to stabilize, recover, and transition, I think is going to be the next step. It's going to take time, and you're going to have to give people the opportunity to posture themselves in a way where they can become active players in this. And there's got to be more pressure put on the Venezuelan government to release all of its political prisoners. The same thing in Cuba. And you can start making these incremental steps that I think Secretary Rubio is in the process of doing. I'm not there. I'm not privy to that information. But I see that as a definite possibility. And over the long term, there are some promising possibilities for both Venezuela and Cuba. This is a dynamic situation. I think the Chinese are seeing that they're losing influence in Venezuela and Cuba, so they're going to look at where they can still make sure they're anchored into Latin America. So I would be looking at Peru. I'd also be looking at Brazil because that's a key player. Brazil has so many natural resources that China desires that there needs to be some type of a conversation taking place with Lula, asking him to see whose side he's really on and how we can at least come to some type of a more favorable accommodation where Brazil comes back into better alignment with the United States. And I think that that's a possibility that can occur at the diplomatic levels with especially with Secretary Rubio that really understands the hemisphere. There hasn't been a Secretary of State that fully understands the nature of relations with our partners in the region than him.
What would you recommend in terms of policy at this point to President Trump? Sergio, you served him in the past. What's your counsel at the moment now?
Well, I think it's to take advantage of the gains and work to moving Venezuela and Cuba in closer alignment with us. I think that there's significant pressure that can be put on both of them because they're not in a good place and their people are getting restive. And, just to give you an idea, so one of the things you got to deal in Venezuela, since I lived there for 3 years, before I went there, I knew of no one who had ever been carjacked in my life, ever. By the time I left Venezuela, I knew 22 people who had been carjacked. So that was before and during Chavez. The point that I'm making there is that they can also be restive again, and then you're going to have a bigger problem.
Well, we seem to have truncated that. We will fix it in post-production. Sergio, thank you. This is important background, especially the tie-in between Venezuela and Cuba. We're going to hear finally from a very prominent figure, a leader in many capacities over many years in his native Peru, as well as its representative at the United Nations. Francisco Tudella is the former vice president of Peru. He also served as its foreign minister, was, interestingly enough, the senior most Peruvian government official who was taken hostage by the Shining Path when they seized a party that had been hosted by the Japanese embassy back many years ago. His tale of escaping their not so tender mercies is quite an interesting one. Francisco also joined us on Securing America earlier today. We are very, very much pleased that he was able to join us in this fashion. His insights into, in particular, what the collapse of the Cuban regime will mean for his country and others throughout the region that have, to varying degrees, suffered egregiously from the blight of communism and the subversion of the Castro regime and its friends. His insights into all of this and the hopefulness that he has, I hope you will find inspiring, as did I. Let's go to the video with the Honorable Francisco Tudella now.
I think that Cuba is a myth in Latin America and around the world. You have these T-shirts of the Che Guevara and the idea that Cuba suffers from a kind of perpetual embargo from the United States. That has not been true. Cuba has been trading with the whole world, and now it has an embargo, but it's an embargo that it's seeking the freedom of Cuba. The problem is with who the US has to negotiate to get that freedom. And so the fall of the Venezuelan dictatorship and the system, the gradual system that has been established in Venezuela, has in fact by itself blocked this parasite state that is Cuba, that lived from Venezuelan oil. That situation is finished. Cuba has been in a very aggressive mood in the last decades. It has built up the Forum of Sao Paulo, that is a fifth communist international in Latin America and Spain, with José Ignacio da Silva Lula, the president of Brazil, in 1990, just before, 1 year before the fall of the Soviet Union. And with the help of the G2, the Cuban intelligence service, they have been extremely subversive in Latin America and cooperated with Chavez, with Maduro, with Lula, with the Kirchner and Peronist government in Argentina before Milei. It has had with Evo Morales in Bolivia, with Humala in Peru, it has had a huge negative influx in this continent. So if Cuba is liberated, the mythology of the Latin American socialist state will be finally destroyed. I think that the US, especially in the case of Iraq in 2003, learned a very important lesson. You cannot decapitate a regime, fire its armed forces, fire its police, and expect not to have an insurgency and a huge resistance. So in fact, we are now in a transitional period. Of course, it's a dangerous period in which you have to negotiate with those elements of the communist regime that want to collaborate and that want in a certain way to gain certain immunity. I have the impression that is the case of Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. So in fact, I don't believe that we'll have a color revolution in Cuba. I do believe that when communist regimes, because Cuba is different from Venezuela, that when communist regimes crumble, they become dust, as it happened in Romania, as it happened in Eastern Europe. So in fact, what we have to have in mind is that the fall of the Cuban regime might be more similar to the Eastern European communist regimes when they went down between 1989 and 1990 than to the Venezuelan case. Because it's a very rigid structure of the Communist Party. Venezuela was a kind of populist government, but of course it was Marxist-Leninist, but it hadn't the structure and the intelligence services that has Cuba. If that is undermined, the whole structure will fall and become dust. That's what the negotiations between the US and the Cuban regime is looking for. The danger is, of course, always that the Castro family, or this huge military conglomerate headed by the Castro family that controls all economic activity in the island, might keep part of its power and become a corrupt oligarchy. So that must be avoided. The way to avoid it must be looked for, must be sought. I think that the influence of China is shrinking. It's shrinking because of the proactive access of the US to Latin America. Two central documents, a strategy for national security of the White House, dated November 2025, released the 4th of December, and then the Strategy for National Defense, the Pentagon document. Those two documents have been read in all of Latin America. The priority now of the US, of course, that doesn't mean setting aside Europe or its allies in NATO, but the priority is to make the Western Hemisphere safe for freedom, safe for democracy, representative democracy, safe for its Western roots, because we have to understand that Latin America forms part of the historical Western world. Its political categories are 100% Western. So it's not like in Asia, like Vietnam, in which you can accept a kind of dictatorship with which the US would be in good relations. Latin America has the republican system as the base of all its politics. The idea is to develop that republican state, to have a free economy and no extra hemispheric powers having an hegemonic position in this country. This lesson has been learned by everyone.
Fascinating insights, as well as a very hopeful picture of what may come in Latin America, not just in Cuba, if indeed the government of the Castro dynasty collapses. To assess whether that is in fact in prospect. We wanted to reserve to our last presentation and the one live here in our webinar, the insights of a man I've gotten to know a little bit of late and am enormously impressed by. His name is Rick Clay. He is a Marine and Army Reserve veteran, as well as a geopolitical analyst, highly accomplished entrepreneur, but also a man who has served his country in Iraq during the efforts to reconstruct the country in the aftermath of its liberation by American forces. That I think has given him insights into and a very highly sophisticated ability to assess the kinds of dynamics that are at work in Cuba today. He's the author of a piece that we will post momentarily, I hope, at the website of the Committee on the Present Danger China. That would be presentdangerchina.org, entitled The Structural and Systemic Collapse of Cuba. And it actually goes so far as to assign a timeline for that to happen. I believe the paper was issued on the 14th of March, and the window in which our next presenter, Rick Clay, is speculating these various forces, which he will, I hope, describe for you, will in combination make absolutely inevitable the fall of the Castro government, perhaps within as short a time as 14 days, and as long a time as 30. So we're going to hear from Rick, and then we'll have an opportunity to engage in a bit of back and forth with him after his presentation. And I'm very, very grateful to you, Rick, for both patiently waiting for these other presentations to be made, but also for capping off our webinar with your deep dive on the things that are operating at the moment that are, from our perspective, very, very promising indeed for the people of Cuba, and as we've been discussing, hopefully for the hemisphere as well. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you for having me on, Frank. I appreciate that very much. I enjoyed your guest analysis of that, because it actually feeds into every aspect of the letter. I mean, of the study that you're going to graciously post on your site. And you can't think about Cuba in an asymmetric way. You have to look at it what I call a geospatial symmetric warfare. And what that means is Cuba has a big effect on just about every theater that we're currently involved in a large way or a small way. And that is it's an underlying campaign, symmetric warfare, that the current administration has shifted. And as your previous guests and other guests have said, under the national security strategy, we've moved our focus away from Europe. Now, that's not to say, just like your previous guests have said, that it's not important. It's very important to us. But we have focused to more of a Indo-Pacific theater. Also, with another focus on the Monroe Doctrine. And quite frankly, I believe that the people like to refer to what's being done in our hemisphere as the Donroe Doctrine. And quite frankly, I believe in 100% is exactly what it should be called now. Growing up, when I was going through my political science years, when I was in my formative years, I studied the Monroe Doctrine, and I always thought that this was, our hemisphere was often being overlooked. And it was. And the only time that it ever became, part of the central national security strategy was Cuba, and its relationship to Russia, the Soviet Union. I'm sorry. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, China has stepped into that void, slowly and slowly and slowly. Now, a lot of people think that China's incursion into our Western Hemisphere actually is a new occurrence. It's not. It's not. It's been around for a long, long time. Particularly, almost as soon as the Soviet Empire collapsed, China started moving into the hemisphere in a very big way, and mostly it had to do with oil and gas at the beginning. A lot of people don't understand that the geology of Cuba, right off its coast, there's a very large oil and gas field, and the Cubans actually leased that out to China, just as they have done in Venezuela. And then you have migration. China, its next step was with the open border policies. It started coming into our hemisphere in a very big way with immigration. A good friend of mine, who's Michael Yon, Y-O-N, he's a gentleman that I've known for many years. He's a war correspondent. He loves to go into these progressive areas. He spent a lot of time down in the Darien Gap. And for your listeners who don't know what the Darien Gap is, it's down in Panama, and you're looking at the area where most of the migrants who are coming into or on their way to the United States have to go through that area. The Chinese set up this is jungle area. 10% of the people that go into the Darien die for a lot of reasons. But the Chinese set up a bunch of waypoints with, I might add, the knowledge of the United States government. Sometimes we even argue they didn't help, but they set up a series of way stations where they're Chinese. Only the Chinese migrants that were coming through that gap had a place get food, medical care, and also funds. And then they would move on to the next way station until they got through the Darien before they made the rest of the trip back into the United States. And they were coming in by the thousands, just like, tens of thousands, if not way more than that, actually. And they're all at military age males. And so that was one of their big incursions that they came in. The next one that they came into the United States was actually the port facilities out in the Caribbean basin, and particularly on the port facilities in Panama. Now, enter this geospace here. We have Donald Trump and the new administration with their refocus on the Indo-Pacific and into this hemisphere. And he immediately started challenging those pillars of the Chinese movement into the hemisphere. And the first one, as everybody is very familiar with, he closed down the border, and to the point where actually the Darien Gap is no longer that transient point. It's still there, but it actually has seen a reverse migration back through the Darien Gap, and so that part of their strategy and the recursion into this hemisphere has stopped to a great deal. And then the next one, as we all familiar with, is the ports in Panama. The ports in Panama, the Panamanian government had just made their ruling that that they're taking those ports away, and they've agreed to the sale to the U.S. controlled firms. That is huge, absolutely huge. And then you look at the port facilities throughout the Caribbean basin. The Belt and Road Initiative was very big in the Caribbean basin. There's 26 major ports in the Caribbean basin, and China basically almost controlled all of them. Their Belt and Road, they would come in, they would build these ports, and with their own equipment. They had the metadata from this equipment. The intelligence gathering capability of that was tremendous, and a lot of people don't understand the impact of that. Well, the Caribbean, the Belt and Road Initiative is really losing out of its favor, and it's throughout the whole world, because a lot of people have learned that the Belt and Road Initiative is basically where the Chinese, their economy is built on debt, and they build up this big debt with these ports, and they know very good and well these Caribbean countries cannot pay that back, and because the long play is not them paying back. The long play is actually to seize control of those assets, and that's what they were doing. Now the United States, through the DFC and Exim Bank, are moving into that space right now. And there's a big push right now in the Caribbean-based governments that are wanting to get out from underneath their obligations to the Chinese government and replace that with U.S. financing through the DFC. That's the United States Financing Corporation. They do a lot of the underwriting for U.S. loans, and they work with all the major banks. And we're going very heavily into the Caribbean basin now, and that is a very good thing. And then the other big pillar that China has moved into was Cuba. Now, and Cuba and Venezuela, and you have to look at this as a world stage, as a world geopolitical arena that Trump is moving against. What happens in Venezuela and Cuba reverberated all over into his complete strategy, and that is to confront China. And he's doing it. He's doing it in such a way that the United Nations or the world has never seen a doctrine like this or a strategy like this since the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Now, many people who understand what that means, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 basically outlined the borders and the geopolitical space of the Middle East that we now that we're dealing with. It was a transformative agreement that was put into motion by the world powers, and it has shaped the world powers ever since 1916. Most of our conflicts in the Middle East and how they affect all these different regions. And Trump's new strategy that he's taken on to China and where he's going into the Middle East, what he's doing with Iran and so forth, has just absolutely geared at blunting the Chinese juggernaut that was building up. Now, everybody makes a big deal about the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is not what it seems to be. It's teetering, and Trump knows this. I've given many reports on the state of the Chinese economy, and at no time in our relationship in modern history with China, and I would probably take that back to Obama, but not Obama, Clinton, because China hadn't really stepped onto the world stage until Clinton gave them world status and world trade status, and then they just ballooned, exploded, and they've been gradually, meteorically moving up the chain, and for the first time since that, the early 90s. The United States is in it's in its most strong position that it's ever been in against China, against our near peer adversaries that we considered was China, Russia, and that was really pretty much it. Other powers were just axes of evils. They were the Johnny come lately players, and Iran was in that stage. Now, what you see now, what's going on in Cuba. I've looked at a lot of the things that's happened, that structurally is wrong with Cuba, and there's so many. You have it's a convergence of the governance of decay, of the economic insolvency, in its energy collapse, social fragmentation, geopolitical instability. These are things that have been going on for years that are now culminating. When Cuba lost its lifeline to Russia, it really impacted them tremendously because they had built this economy based upon a fake energy reserve. And that energy reserve was Russia and Venezuela. Without either one of those, their economy can't exist. They only have two main power plants in that whole country. As we're speaking right now, most of Cuba, outside of Havana, only get power about 2, maybe 3 days a week for 4 hours. That's it. And some places don't even get that. And of course, if you don't have power, you don't have you don't have sewer systems, you don't have water. The infrastructure completely falters. And they had an antiquated infrastructure system to begin with. Their power system, the grid system, their water distribution systems, their sewer systems, their dry storage, cold storage. A lot of people don't look at that stuff. I do. And they're in collapse right now, systemic collapse, because they don't have the power to do this. And I'll give you a case in point that just happened. Code Pink, who is a left-wing organization that's funded, by the way, by the Chinese. It's an American that lives in Singapore, and he's one of the big. He's a Marxist. He's a Maoist, actually, and he funds a lot of these left-wing organizations. Well, they just went to Cuba to celebrate, to protest against, this as inhumane blockade that the United States has imposed on Cuba, as far as oil is concerned, from Venezuela and from Russia. And they went down there and they stayed there's a little area in Havana, which is a tourist area, and they stayed there. Very expensive, very exclusive. It is the only place in Cuba that gets 24-hour power, and it's only like a 2 or 3 block area that gets it. And they threw a concert. Now, when we think about a concert, we think about thousands of people. No, this was only probably about 1,000 people. And it's more aligned to a concert you would see at the beach on spring break. But the power that they drew, that they had to draw for that small concert, drew from the city. And the whole city the city went through brownout. 7 people died in the hospital because they didn't have enough power to keep the respirators going. And they didn't have the emergency backup systems to run it. They didn't have the fuel. So that gives you just a current day look at the systemic collapse that's going to happen in Cuba. And you can't talk about Cuba without talking about Venezuela. Rodriguez in Venezuela, the new interim president, has agreed with the Trump administration to curtail oil shipments to Venezuela, which they dramatically depended upon. When you look at Venezuela and Cuba, that relationship, Cuba is, as your previous guests have accurately pointed out, they are the brains. And Venezuela was basically the muscle. But then on top of that muscle, you had, as your previous guest with the Central Intelligence Agency pointed out, you basically have an occupying force in Venezuela that was the Cuban intelligence service and special forces, and that's why we went and got Maduro. We killed nothing but Cubans, and now that we have Monroe Doctrine, that Trump and Rubio and them are pushing. If you look at Central and South America, almost 92% of the, maybe as high as 95% of the countries that are in that have switched from a socialist communist government to democracy, and a lot of them to a conservative democracy. And you're getting ready to see that in Cuba. Cuba really, I don't see it from looking from my perspective as infrastructure, because that's what I look at. I look at infrastructure, physical infrastructure. I don't see how they last any more than 30 days. And I think we're about in the midpoint of that right now. Actually, there's already secret negotiations. They're not secret. It's not, if it's a secret enough, people don't know it. But a lot of people know about it. Rubio is talking to Castro right now, the Castro family. They are negotiating a transition right now. While the terms of that transition, I'm not really too sure of it yet, but one is trying to secure, the Castro's seat and power, not seat and power, but their economic interest in Cuba, the money. And that's what's being negotiated right now, and bringing in these democratic forces that currently exist. And I know that part of those talks is the Cuban, the Cuban resistance in Miami. Their leaders are actually involved in that discussion with Cuba. So Cuba really knows it's sitting on the precipice of looking over that cliff if they're not already taking the first step over. It's just who's going to, just the question is when they finally lose their balance and go over. they physically can't do it. And a lot of, and there's another aspect of this that I like to point out that people don't really understand about Cuba, is I think Cuba's this beautiful island, which it is, but it's actually geologically unstable. And so when you have infrastructure, and I have a big background in infrastructure, when you have infrastructure, if you have a unstable geology, it dramatically affects the solvency or the capability of that infrastructure to work. Well, so you have an aging system that does not have any fuel to keep it going. Then on top of that, you have an infrastructure system that is adversely affected almost daily or weekly by seismic activity. And when we get into the hurricane season, it's even going to be worse. And they do not have the ability to reconstitute those systems. It's the same thing that's happening in Iran right now as well. And now, what does Cuba? If Cuba falls, what does that mean in the world? Because I pointed out earlier, it has an effect on a lot of different places. Let's look at Russia, for instance. Russia, as we all know, is going through this horrible war where you have anywhere between 1,000 casualties in a day sometimes, and you're looking at a lot of those soldiers that are going into what they call meat assaults. The Russians are launching are from Cuba. Cuba was exporting a lot of its young men and men to Russia as contractors. They were they were going there for construction work and whatever. And they ended up in the next thing they knew, they were given a gun and a uniform, and they were put on the front lines against the Ukrainians and told to charge. And so that now is gone. I think there were 15, almost 20,000 Cubans. The last time I checked, that had actually entered that fight. And no one knows what the casualty rate of what they have. But when you have a kill ratio, I think the kill ratio now in Ukraine is 1 to 10, which is unheard of. So I would say they're pretty much decimated. So you've taken a large chunk of human flesh, I hate to say it that way, off the board for Russia. And Russia cannot, it cannot resupply Cuba. I know there's a flotilla. And I love it when they said flotilla, because I looked into it. Russian flotilla that was going to challenge the U.S. blockade. Well, what it was a Russian destroyer that was moving into Cuba, but it had a tanker with it. That tanker, everybody said, well, that's an oil tanker. Yeah, it is. It's an oil tanker to provide fuel for the destroyer. and if when it gets to Havana and it offloads, if it would offload everything it had, the Russian ship couldn't get back to Russia, go back to its Baltic base. It would never make it, and the fuel that would be dropped off would be minuscule. So it's not what the press made it out to be. So at that point, that's pretty much how I see how China is actually being blunted in this geospatial symmetric warfare that we are perpetrating against them now. And we are in one of the best positions we've ever been in. When Trump does go to China, he is going to be in a very, very strong position, because he'll have, if what I think is going to happen in the Middle East, as far as the Gulf, and those Marines do take Cog Island, and I believe that if there is not a settlement before then, that's most likely what we're headed for. Then you control. Once you control that, it's like 17% of the oil that goes into China as far as exports. Then when you add that to all the other sources of oil that we as Western powers actually have influence over, whether through choke points or for direct relations, economic relations, you're looking at 90% of China's fuel, oil reserves or energy reserves coming into it that we would control. And that is a huge bargaining chip, a huge 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 positioning chip for Trump when he goes in there. And the Chinese economy is not the Chinese economy that everybody thinks it is right now. It is teetering. Its financial markets are teetering. They're having to infuse for massive amounts into the regional banking systems. Their banking failures are going through the roof. They're trying to switch from. Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me just interrupt you. You're on a roll, and each of these excursions that you've taken off the main topic are worth a webinar in their own right, and we look forward to having you back to do that. But I did want to just take a few minutes to do some Q&A with you before we have to wrap the program. And thank you for an extraordinarily impressive and I think compelling description of why it is that is really in prospect now, unless somehow we decide we're going to try to prop it up, perhaps a Venezuelan solution, as the president has come to call what he did in the absence of Nicolas Maduro. And I'd like to ask you about that. I believe that he has taken an interest in your analyses in the past, and perhaps is actually taking counsel from you. What are your thoughts about this prospect that in the interest of stability, as we've been hearing a lot about in connection with Iran, of course, we need to try to work with the existing governmental structures and not have an Iraq kind of chaotic transition. You have the experience of having been in the middle of that chaos, I think, and I'd be very interested in your recommendation as to how the president should proceed in all of this.
Well, you get to a point where I was getting ready to. I was actually getting ready to go into that a little bit. I saw firsthand. I was actually involved in that process in Iraq, nation building, and I saw the failures. I saw the successes, and there were tremendous successes. Believe me, they just weren't reported. But the one thing that we learned, and one thing that Trump has learned from this, is not to go into nation building. You go into it just a little bit, but you don't really go into nation building like we did in Iraq, where we did everything. I mean, you're looking at a guy that I actually had a hand in actually writing the Iraqi Constitution. Particularly when it comes to home rule, a little hillbilly guy from West Virginia, and the mistakes are going to be made. So, but the Trump administration is not wanting to go into nation building, and I think that's rightly so. You do these military operations, to decapitate or maybe enforce change and so forth. But you try to work with the existing existing apparatus and trying to establish a more friendly type of government that is there. It's basically I call it the George Patton strategy, actually. George Patton, after the war, he got in big trouble for, of taking German expertise, that was currently there, that was already structured, and he kept it in place in order to make a functional country, because he was in charge of a certain area, a very large area actually, and it actually survived quite well because he utilized what was there. He only took the decapitation. In Iraq we call it debafication. We actually took second, third, fourth tier managers off the board, which was the wrong thing to do, because we needed the third and fourth tier guys to run the country. We didn't need the first and second tiers. They were the guys with blood on their hands. We got rid of them. Get rid of them. But the third and fourth tier guys you keep, and that's what he's did in Venezuela. He took out the big guy. He's agreed. He's allowed Rodriguez to stay in power in an interim basis as long as she does certain things. And as your guest said, with a gun to her head, Yeah, and then you have the Nobel Prize winner. She's in the wings, and I think and she's going to they'll have elections, and then the Venezuelan people will decide, hopefully, who governs their country. In the meantime, that apparatus that still was operating the country is still in place in Venezuela. But they have to, there are certain conditions that they have to meet, or, hey, it's the next guy up, and we're going to see to it. Same thing you see in Iran. You see us currently doing that in Iran. You don't get into the nation building part of it, because then you have to have a security presence. You have to have a financial presence in a very, very, very big way. You have to have a technical and expertise presence there, and that's hard to find, to be quite honest with you. To run that country.
Let me just ask you, though, Rick, to sort of tease this out. There are those who believe, and I think I'm among them, that if you wind up preserving a regime, especially if, as we're now hearing, one of the candidates for the replacement for the Ayatollah is one of the most vicious butchers of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that's saying something, that you wind up, betraying the people of the country in question, and presumably, at least for a time, perpetuating their enslavement by these horrible, totalitarians, whether they're of the Islamist stripe or the communist stripe or of some combination, perhaps. What is your recommendation? I get that, nation building is not something we want to engage in, but what's the alternative that does not wind up leaving, essentially that oppressive mechanism in place, as I'm concerned is true in Venezuela at the moment? Your thoughts?
I understand it is a big concern. That type of governance is very, very hard. You have to encourage Venezuela. You're seeing that right now. He took out the head, but the apparatus is still there. All right, and they have to meet certain conditions, and one of those conditions is going to be free and open elections. And so the Venezuelan people have to make that stand. They're the ones who have to get up, and they have to make that stand. Same thing you see in Russia right now. I mean, not Russia. Iran. The president and the crown prince have all said, hey, just right now. They even made it today. I even saw the announcement by the admiral Cooper that the the Iranian people are going to stay in the place, but it's up to the Iranian people and the Venezuelan people to do their part. And that is sometimes it's going to be bloody, as we have seen in Iran already. And it may very well be bloody in Venezuela, but they have to stand up, and we're going to see the same thing in Cuba. You have to give those those abilities, those governments there, if you want to call them that right now, the ability to sustain themselves, and that is infrastructure. That is the beans, the bullets, the butter. They need all of that. They need the fuel. They need the lights to come on. They need the food to come in, and so forth. And then they have to stand up, and we have to set the stage so that they can step in. There's no cookie cutter. To take a cookie cutter pattern, put it in Venezuela, then put it in Cuba, and then take it in Iran will fail. You've got it. Each one has to be specifically designed for that particular culture. Culture is very, very important when you develop these systems and put these practices in.
Let me just ask you a final question here. Given your analysis of the situation in Cuba and the dire prospects in each of the, I think it was 7 different, component parts of the unraveling, the systemic collapse that you're forecasting, is there an alternative here to essentially making all of these Cubans sort of wards of our country, if it does in fact come apart at the seams? How do you see the way ahead for that country? I take the point that each is unique, but I think we've all been impressed by the entrepreneurial skills and productivity and success of Cubans who've come to this country. Presumably, a lot of them, even though they've been indoctrinated and worn down by communism, will, if given the opportunity, demonstrate similar kinds of ability and thereby give hope for the country's future. But there's going to be a period where it sounds as though there's no power. There may be a lot of, structural damage done already or coming due to the geological conditions. The other sort of lingering legacies of the ancien regime. What's the way forward, sir, in Cuba specifically?
Well, Cuba, I think these talks are going to be, these talks are very key. And I really have faith in Rubio and being able to, I think Rubio might probably go down the most consequential Secretary of State since Kissinger, to be honest with you. And he understands the language, he understands the people, he understands the culture. All right, that's huge. That's very good. I think that he's going to be able to work out a system or agreement with them that the powers that are still there will actually relinquish their power to some degree and agree to some different types of democratic governance. And how that works, there's so many different variables that can come into play, and that's what you're going to see. I don't think you're going to see a structural collapse on the scale that you see and what we saw in Haiti, just to use an example in our own hemisphere. If you look at Cuba outside of Havana looks like Haiti almost. So but I don't think you're going to see that type of collapse. I don't think we will allow that to happen. And I don't think the world's going to allow that to happen because quite frankly, once that mechanism is put into place, that governance mechanism is put into place, which I think is going to be based on democratic elections, you're going to see almost instantaneous, and I mean this literally, it's going to be a gold rush. There's so much gold there. You're going to see an oil and gas rush. There's so much oil and gas on the shelf right outside out there. We've known that for decades. It's not a secret. And only the Chinese have been able to exploit it. We haven't. And you're going to see a land economic development rush like you've never seen before since the days when when we told everybody to go out west. There's free land out there. You're going to see a huge rush going into Cuba. So I don't think I don't think you're going to see the big migration out of Cuba either. I think the people of Cuba love Cuba. They absolutely love it. They're so much they're willing to go through the hardships they're going through.
Yeah, well, indeed, there may be a considerable remigration from.
And I think there will be actually. I really think there will be, and that's a good thing. And capitalism and democracy will lift them up. It will.
Yeah. Well, and again, to the point of this program, it will undoubtedly, if it happens in Cuba, it will undoubtedly further reinforce the trends or the impulses that each of you has spoken of in your various ways to, give a new lease on life to people throughout the Western Hemisphere, those especially who have been suffering under one form or another of this kind of socialist or worse yet communist, oppression. Rick Clay, thank you for being the last man standing. In fact, the only one literally standing for the moment in this program. I'm so grateful to our other speakers, Captain Jim Fenel, Sam Fattis, Sergio de la Pena, and of course, the Honorable Francisco Tudella. It's been a very important conversation, and one that I think is probably as hopeful as any that we've been able to show in this space. Not least, Rick, to some of your points about the trouble that the Chinese are in as well. The Chinese Communist Party is in, and I look forward to another conversation soon in which we talk about putting the CCP on the ash heap of history. We're going to leave it at that for the moment. Thank you to you all for listening, either in real time or in the further circulation of this program. We urge you to help with that by sharing it with your circles of influence, that you will, in fact, as a result, go forth and multiply. God bless you all. Over now.